What ultimately brought you to Harvard in 1974?
Radcliffe. By that time, I was working on women in higher education, history of women in higher education, and Radcliffe was in a bit of a quandary because Radcliffe had no faculty, had never had faculty. It had hired impecunious Harvard faculty to come teach their course at Radcliffe. In the World War II, they started merging classes because they didn't have enough men. And so Polly Bunting, in 1960 had created a Radcliffe Institute of Independent Study. And it had a wonderful initial director, Connie Smith, who died prematurely. And it had been sort of floundering. And so Martina Horner, who was then the president of Radcliffe, wanted another senior woman to run this Radcliffe Institute of Independent Study, which then, up to that point, had been providing small stipends, what they call babysitter money, to talented women who would come to the Radcliffe Institute. But it was not salary replacement. I mean, that was, if you're going to be a professional woman, you don't need babysitting money. You need full-time support to be able to go to the library all day. And so they wanted some changes, and so I came as vice president of Radcliffe and dean of the Radcliffe Institute. But I knew that if on the cards was negotiating a new arrangement between Radcliffe and Harvard, and that I was supposed to work with the president of Radcliffe and the chair of the Radcliffe board and the vice chair of the Radcliffe board, and I was made a member of the Radcliffe board too. So we had 4 Radcliffe board members, the president of Radcliffe, the chair, co-chair, and me, negotiating with Harvard over the Radcliffe-Harvard relationship. And I knew that since I had tenure in New York, that they shouldn't hire me if I didn't know that I shouldn't insist on having tenure when I came to Harvard. So I went to see Mr. Bach, Derek Bach, who was president of Harvard, and I was very forthright with him. I said, you may not want to give me tenure. I can certainly understand that. But you also need to understand that I'm not considering this position without it. And you shouldn't consider me if I didn't know enough about academic life and academic administration to insist on this. So, there were a few sneezes and a hiccup or two. But a week later, I got a letter offering me tenure at Harvard and the director of the Radcliffe Institute and a professor in a professorship at Harvard.
So you came in as a professor?
Absolutely. Okay. I mean, if you were going to Radcliffe, which was the big underdog, I mean, it was a complete, utter underdog. If it was going to negotiate with Harvard on any terms, it had to have as many as possible of its negotiating team having stature within the university.
And you were the first female dean at Harvard University.
Well, that was later. The Radcliffe deanship didn't mean anything to Harvard. And so after this, what you might call direct exchange with the president of Harvard when I came to Radcliffe and as a professor of education at Harvard, history of education, we got a new agreement with Radcliffe and Harvard in '77, and the Harvard team had 5 on its team and 4 on the Radcliffe team, and one of the 5 was the vice president for finances at Harvard, a guy named Hale Champion, wonderful man. And he and I, of course, had argued vigorously. While I wanted to hang on, the big issue was hanging on to Radcliffe's endowment and not giving it to Harvard. And my argument was that Radcliffe had its money was for the education of women. There was no single pot of money anywhere for the education of women, and it should remain, and that should remain Radcliffe's principal activity. Harvard's position was, well, we're going to educate the girls. I said, come on. You're educating them cheaper than any other university anywhere. Yale, Princeton had just gone co-ed. but you're doing this cheaper. Radcliffe needs to hang on to its endowment. Well, we hung on to the endowment. And so Hale Champion had left, the finance vice president of Harvard, gone to the Carter administration as the number 2 person in the secretary in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And so the day we were signing the Harvard-Radcliffe agreement, he called me up and he said, got me at where I was upstairs signing. And the president and secretary came upstairs and said, HEW, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare is calling. Oh, said Henry Rosofsky, the dean, they must be wanting one of my faculty. No, the secretary said they want Pat Graham. And so I went down, and it was Hale on the phone. He said, Joe Califano, the secretary of HEW, wants to talk to you about coming as director of the National Institute of Education. I said, Hale, are you behind this? Yes, he said. He said, I thought we could keep on arguing.
Sure.
So we were very friendly, and so I went.
How long were you there?
A little over 2 years, which is a maximum leave you could take from Harvard. And in the second year, my husband got an offer from MIT to leave Columbia to come to MIT, so we didn't have to commute between New York and Boston, and we moved to Cambridge.
Okay, so you were a professor of education history here then?
I was professor. Then when I came back from the government, I was given a chair at Harvard, the Charles Warren Chair in the History of Education.
And that's where you have your emeritus professor
that's right.
now, emerita.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So you were then in 1982 to 1991 Harvard's first
I was
female
named dean in 81, became dean in 82.
And so that was a 10-year term as dean.
Yeah, it was busy.
Much longer than the average too. So successful and busy.
It was busy.